Hi, everybody. Good evening and welcome to Evoke Therapy Program's broadcast. I'm Dr. Brad Reedy, and today is Tuesday, May 31st, 2022, the last day of May. For those of you that might be new to our format, tonight's broadcast is a question and answer. You're always welcome as a current Evoke client or alumni client to invite family and friends to these broadcasts, the question and answer, so they can ask questions. If you want to ask questions for them, if you're getting asked questions by the people in your lives about therapy, about the Evoke process, you're welcome to ask me those questions, and I'll do my best to answer them. Also, questions can be sent in always in advance to webinar@evoketherapy.com, or any leftover questions from the previous broadcast I will take up. To add one more thing to that queue, I'm going to talk tonight about some posts on social media that several people this week in the last week or two have been asking me to respond to, and I've promised that today's episode will address that. So let's get right into those questions. Then I'll take the pre-submitted questions, and then last any live questions. I wrote this week. I posted this week. It says, trusting your instincts is great, but have you ever tried long-term therapy to learn to distinguish between your trauma responses and responses that arise from your authentic self? As I think about this idea about going to therapy so that we can distinguish between a trauma response and a response that comes from an authentic and healed, intact place, my first answer, in fact, some of the responses that I've given to people on social media are, me too. This is my work. This is why I still go to therapy. This is why I go to therapy each week, to rediscover and to find myself. And part of what I count on or rely on from my therapist is to give me some sense. Like, this sounds like it's coming from your past. It sounds like it's coming from a theme that we visited before. That theme of trying to make people feel happy instead of angry, for example, or whatever it might be. And that maybe in that you might be missing the child or missing your spouse in that moment. So it's those kinds of very simple discussions that I have week after week as I tell my story. Of course, some of it is just listening and validating the feelings to set the stage, because in therapy, one of the things I'm hearing, I can't tell you how much I've heard this in my life and continue to hear this. In fact, I just finished a consulting call just before this broadcast where I was talking to one of my peers, one of the therapists that I work with, who was talking about how there still is this expectation from therapists at our program, not just our wilderness program. That's kind of a given in this example, but even at our intensive program, where it's our job to kick people in the butt. And we were talking about this, and I said, look, I think this is a common sense idea in our culture. I said American culture, but I think it goes beyond the American culture. And I think it's something that, as trauma-informed, attachment-based therapists, we have to continue to fight against. Oftentimes, what I'm talking about is uncommon sense. And so part of the work, revisiting over and over again, is really the work of becoming yourself, discovering you. The flagship program in our intensive program is finding you. It's merely about saying, what went on in my past? How did that shape me? What might be the landmines, the wounds that are unresolved, unhealed, unexplored, that are coming out in this relationship, in this discussion, in this decision over here? And can I start to sort out? I'm sure that you can do that without a therapist. I know that that's possible. That happens to be my way of doing it as a client. I know you can do it in support groups like 12-step groups and meditation. People talk about even psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. I shared something on my social media today that talked about the use of psychedelics in therapy. All of those can be pathways to discovering what's my stuff and how is it affecting the people. And so if you've asked that question, if you're listening to this on the podcast app and you were wondering what I meant about that, it's the work of becoming yourself, of discovering who you are. It's your life's work. And I can imagine, I suppose, theoretically, that somebody arrives at enlightenment. I can, at least theoretically, I can imagine that. But I don't have any experience with anybody arriving. In fact, the most enlightened people I've ever heard speak on the subject of enlightenment, that have ever walked on earth are the ones who say most vociferously that you never arrive, and arriving is death. Arriving is to stop learning and to stop growing. So yes, trusting your instincts is part of the process, but part of psychotherapy, part of attachment-based therapy is developing discernment. I'm going to talk about that on one of the other slides that I'll be discussing tonight. Part of it is discerning what's my fear response, what's my trauma response. Where is this coming from? Is this connecting to my child? Is my response to my child, does it come from a grounded place where I'm seeing them and their needs clearly? Or am I trying to fix something in my past? The wonderful, great Alice Miller said that so often in parenting, we're trying to prevent something that already happened. We're trying to fix something or get something from our children that we ideally would have received from our parents, that we would have received at their hand. And so anybody can imagine. I mean, I'll use the simplest of examples about a father who one time said to his son at the last session in our program, he said, look, I tried to be involved in sports. I tried to come to all of your games, to encourage you, to support you. And the boy said, I didn't really like sports. I was an artist. And I think he said, I know he said this, and I think what he said was that I think that what you were doing was what you wanted from your father. And that's a simple example. And he said, but I didn't want that from you. And the father was profoundly humbled and grateful for the feedback and saw it very, very clearly. And that's a non-dramatic example to kind of illustrate the point. But part of our work, this is all of us. This is Al-Anon. This is whatever guide or teacher or process you use. Part of our work is to untangle ourselves so that when we show up to our relationship with our spouse, with our partner, with somebody at work, with our boss, with our employee, that again, we're responding with them in mind. And that is a lifetime of work, a lifetime of work. I have a few of these that people ask me about. The next one was a post that I said, in therapy, new ideas can be just beyond our understanding. Often, the reason is not because of an intellectual deficit, but because the concept threatens the defense and is therefore outside the reality we created to make ourselves feel safe. So often, in fact, one of the things that is my greatest challenge as a teacher of therapy, as a supervisor and a trainer to other therapists, is this idea that I'm not just up against a kind of an academic limitation or an intellectual unknowing. In fact, my experiences across the board, with almost no exceptions that I can think of, that everybody that I'm trying to teach has the intellect to be able to learn what I'm teaching them. But really, it's about some defense. For example, I'll give you one example. The example of attachment-informed therapy, where we really do hold the parents to account for the way that they impact the child. And if the parent will allow us to, we can also have that exact same compassionate lens to look at the parent's childhood. Really, that's what the journey of the heroic parent is about. It's about having the courage to look at yourself first. And so there's no blame or shame here. It's not like, look, it's mom and dad's fault, because if it's mom and dad's fault, they can pass it on to their parents, and they can pass it on to their parents, and so on and so on and so on. So the work is about being able to be an adult, take responsibility, to know how we dent our children, and that their responses, their maladaptive responses, are in oftentimes a developmental trauma. In other words, they are in reaction to how we parented them. And by looking at it through that lens, that compassionate lens, everybody in the family can be liberated. I think what draws parents into the Evoke podcasts, into these podcasts, the listeners, the watchers in the Evoke work, is because we're saying something different. The parents that I work with that write me each week talking about the impact of the work that we do on them are saying, look, you were telling me something that I knew, but that nobody ever told me. And oftentimes I say, the reason nobody told you is because the therapists who have been working with you before probably didn't do their own work. And it's not a, by the way, I just want to be clear as I can. It's not Evoke philosophy. This is attachment informed, trauma informed therapy. This is what Gabor Mate is talking about, and Bessel van der Kolk is talking about, and all the attachment theorists are talking about. This is what D.W. Winnicott and Melanie Klein and Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung are talking about. These are what the masters are talking about. I'm just passing it on through me to you all, and I'm sure many of you are passing it on to your family and friends and loved ones also. So there's no pride in this work. It's just, look, I'm trying to give you some ideas that somebody gave to me. So most often, the barrier to the work is that the child or the adult is still holding on to and protecting the parents. If they fully express the anger and the woundedness that they feel as a child, it will threaten the parents' need to be good. And because the child took on the responsibility of supporting the parents' goodness, they never got out of it. But then it trips them up when they have their own children. The children are saying, I'm mad, I don't like what you're doing, I'm angry, I'm sad, I'm hurt, I'm confused, I'm lost. And if we need to be good, we can't hear any of that. We have to tell the child how it's because somehow they're broken or confused or imagining things or blowing things out of proportion. They're at the most insidious level, we tell them that they are unaccountable. We tell them that, yes, I may have made mistakes, but you got to pick yourself up by your bootstraps. This attachment-based model is compassionate to everybody: child, parent, grandparent, great-grandparents, our culture, and so on. Nobody has to take all the blame. It's just the work that we do. So often, if you hear a therapist, if you're working with a teacher or a guide that you trust, you'll hear glimpses, right? It won't make sense to you. I can't tell you. I received a couple of emails this week about this. Somebody said that they asked their parent to listen to the podcast, and they listen to the same ones over and over again, and they can't quite understand what I'm saying. It's not because they're not smart. It's because it threatens their entire framework. That mom and dad were good, saintly people who only did it out of love. And if you have to carry that, if that can't be addressed or challenged, then none of the ideas that attachment-based therapists will teach you will make sense, because it will confront all of that. Everything about that holding up the parent's ego will crumble to the ground. And your ego as a parent, right? Part of this is about, we want to be good. So it can't be about us. My third out of my fourth slide that I wanted to share. I wrote this a couple of weeks ago. It says, fear is one of the devil's names. We must learn to listen without succumbing to all of its urges. Because like all the devils we have learned about, fear speaks in half-truths. Whether it's guilt or shame or fear, my message is not ignore it. It means nothing. That's kind of the simplistic way I think people often internalize what I'm talking about. I'm not saying that. I'm saying listen to it. But again, it's about discernment. If I'm afraid that my child is using drugs and unsafe, that's a real fear for somebody that I love and care about, and somebody to whom I have a responsibility, a role to play in their life. But I go to therapy to learn what that fear is what to do. Because if all I do is grab on tighter to control, I'm succumbing to the urge of fear. If I believe that guilt is the voice of God, the voice of morality, right? If I believe that that's an ethical instinct in me and I respond accordingly, I'm never going to be clear, never going to find who I really am. I'm just gonna go along with what everybody else tells me I should be and should do and should feel and should think. So you can listen to those things, listen to your fears, get curious about them with the help of a guide or a teacher or a mentor or a sponsor or a therapist. You learn what where those voices came from, where that message came from, and what to respond to, what to pay attention to. But our natural instinct for fear is control. The simplest way to describe this, I love this analogy. I was going to use a sports analogy, but my son, who's an artist, gave me a book years ago called Art and Fear. I love the book. And in the book, one of the co-authors shared a story about his teaching a ceramics course in college. And arbitrarily, on the first day of the semester, he split the class into two. And on this left side, he told them, you are going to be graded at the end of the semester. I'll take all of your finished pottery, all of your finished work, and I'll put it on a scale. And you'll be graded by the amount of work that you do. And then he looked to the right side of the class and he said, on this side of the class, you're only going to be graded by one finished product. You get to turn in one assignment and you only have to turn in one. So this class on the left would be graded on, this half of the class on the left would be graded on the bulk of things. The one on the right is one assignment. And he said, at the end of the semester, when he graded everybody, he said, can you guess where the greatest art was produced? And the answer was the people that were graded on the bulk by putting their finished work on a scale. That was by far the best art. The pieces that were the best art came out of that pile. Think about hitting a tennis ball in a tennis match. If you're afraid, you grip it. You try to force it. You try to control it. And you lose power and accuracy. And the lessons go on and on. When I write things, when I write books, when I write blogs or articles or essays, I adopt the mantra that my therapist gave me years ago, and she's a prolific author. She said, write crap. Or as it's said in popular culture sometimes, write drunk and edit sober. Brene Brown talks about how we lose access to creativity when we feel shame and fear. So we listen to those things, but we learn not to impulsively react to what they're suggesting that we do. We learn to discern them. We learn to unravel them, see where they came from, see what they're trying to tell us. The last of my 4 posts from social media doesn't come from my account. It comes from one of my favorite accounts on social media called Sophia Cycles. She's a curator of Jungian quotes and Jungian therapy and Jungian ideas coming from the master Carl Jung. And in this particular quote, she writes, or she shares, wisdom, like compassion, often seems to require of us that we hold multiple realities in our consciousness at once. And that was said by Richard Tarnas, I believe is how you pronounce that, from his work, The Cosmos and the Psyche. That's spelled wrong. But the point is this. Part of mental health is to be able to hold paradox. Dialectical behavioral therapy, which some of you have heard of, is being able to hold two seemingly opposite things. Carl Rogers said the great paradox is that it's only when I accept myself as I am that I can change. A common paradox that we ask or invite parents to embrace, one that I talk about in the journey of the heroic parent, is you're doing the best that you can and you can do better at all times. Both of those things are true at any given moment. In fact, to contrast being able to hold paradoxes and hold multiple realities at once, the borderline personality disorder splits the world into black and white, good and bad, right? Good and evil. That's a young developmental idea. That's a primitive idea. And under stress, under the strain, the human psyche will resort to that black and white thinking. But if it experiences safety over a long period of time, the human psyche will be able to adopt paradox, or excuse me, to accept paradox, to accept multiple realities. We can hold somebody accountable and still have compassion. We can not judge somebody as evil, but still set a boundary not to have them in our lives. We can be angry at somebody and love them. We can be grateful for somebody and still be hurt by them. So wisdom, like compassion, Richard Tarnas says, like mental health, like mental well-being, is full of these paradoxes, these dialecticals. Mental illness looks at the world. Look at social media. Look at the news today. It is us and them. What you're seeing on a grand societal scale is a mental illness. It's why I don't post anything about political issues or about a lot of times I avoid popular issues because they're so polarizing. And part of mental health and therapy and enlightenment is to be able to hold these like Mr. Tarnas says, these multiple realities, these paradoxes, these dialecticals. All right, I'm happy to take any live questions or any questions that have been pre-submitted. Somebody writes, how do you think our society can reduce cultural values of shame around sex? I'm not very good at societal changes. I really am not. I'm a psychotherapist who treats one person, maybe one couple, maybe one family at a time. And so I think about applying it. I'm going to go way off script. Education. I mean, that's not off script, I suppose. 23% or so, the number is pretty close. 23% of adults can't read. They don't have a 6th grade reading level. I think we could start there. I think the antidote, if we're talking about a societal change, is education and reading. I don't even know how do you talk to somebody who can't read at a 6th grade level, an adult? I mean, how do you reason with them? So I think it's education. I think it's exposure. I think it's having the conversation. I'm gonna veer off it a little bit, and this is a real critical point that'll have application to a broad amount of issues for all of you, for you and for your children. Let's talk about you, since I'm talking to you. Imagine that you have an issue. Let's say you are an enabler. You tend to rescue people. When people are in pain, you try to take away their suffering and their pain. Okay? We call that in pop psychology, we call that rescuing or enabling. Okay? And you learn that comes from a wounded place. You learn that comes from an attachment issue that you had in your childhood, and that we call it codependency in popular psychology. So you learn that, you understand that. Now, the first impulse that the average person that I talk to has after they learn that about themselves is, I want to fix it. I want to be not codependent. I want to not enable. I want to not rescue. There's a step that is vital that is being skipped. And I'm going to give you a secret, one of the secrets. Just talk about it. Talk about where you're dented and bruised and flawed. Don't fix your codependency. Talk about your codependency. Don't fix your shame-based response. Name it. Don't fix your body image issue. Talk about it. Don't resolve your anxiety. Talk about your anxiety. I promise you, if it's discover the problem and fix the problem, you're skipping the most important and by far, the bulk of the work, which is becoming comfortable with the fact that you have dents and bruises. So for all of you, what that means, and I could relate it specifically to sex, talk about your discomfort around sex. Talk about your shame. Talk about your avoidance. Talk about how you show up in a limited way. Talk about it with your partners. Talk about it with your children when you can. Talk about it with your colleagues when it's appropriate. The people that you visit with, your siblings, your parents. Name it. When you name it and you talk about it, it loses its power. And over time, you change. Back to Carl Rogers. The curious paradox, it's only when I accept myself that I can change. Don't change. Mental health is not about getting better in a way. Mental health is about realizing how compromised and dented you are, which then leads to you getting better. So for everybody on here who has a goal to improve one thing in their life, I would ask you or invite you to consider, don't improve that this week or next week or this month or next month. Just talk about it when it shows up. I feel an impulse to rescue. I know that this is my anxiety. I know that this is my stuff. I know this is my issue. I feel uncomfortable with my body. I feel uncomfortable talking about sex. I still haven't gotten out from under the blanket of shame that I grew up with when it came to sex or sexual identity or sexual orientation, whatever it is. Don't fix it. The need, the want, the urge to fix it will lead to denial. You'll fool yourself into thinking that you're better off than you are because you have to be good. I will tell you this as clearly as I can. When I had my first child 29 years ago, I thought he was one of the luckiest children on earth because I was me. And I was committed to doing better than my parents, my father specifically. And I was going to commit my life academically to marriage and family therapy. So I thought, what a lucky kid he is. Today, 29 years later, I realize more than ever, by far, how compromised I am today. The irony is, 29 years ago, I thought I was a great dad, and I was running away from guilt and shame as fast as I could. Today, I've made some progress in sitting with my shame and my guilt. It doesn't compromise me. I don't want to run away and hide as much. I don't want to deny it. I don't want to justify it. I don't want to rationalize it as much. I'm a better dad now that I realize I'm not a good dad or a great dad. I'm not getting caught up on the words, right? When you don't know how sick you are, that's when you're at your sickest. When you know how sick you are, and I know that's a strong word, and I'm sorry if it's triggering. You can substitute for a lighter word. When you know how compromised you are, how dented you are, you can be tolerated. It's easy to be around you. Like I say, when people tell me that they have a good childhood, that they had a good childhood, I tell them that therapy can fix that. When parents tell me my kids had a good childhood, I think, oh, this is going to be really, really hard. When parents say, you know what, I made a lot of mistakes, some of which I understand and some of which I don't, I'm thinking, we're in a great spot. All right. Somebody writes this. Our son is 16 and it has been a very long road of serious defiance. I completely agree with your thoughts on being open and non-judgmental in areas of a lot of things. However, reality is, as parents, we are legally responsible for his decisions. He can punch holes in our wall, get kicked out of school, make all sorts of messes. And the reality is our boundaries don't actually count in the real world unless he hits us, according to the police. He can live in our home. If one doesn't have money to send them away to get help, he can stay until he's 18 and terrorize the family. Boundaries are a luxury. I'm not sure I agree with that, but is there a question? I don't know if there's a question in that, but I would say for this person, go to Al-Anon, go to Codependence Anonymous, learn how to deal with things that you have no power over, because that's what you're speaking to, right? Boundaries are more internal than they are external. and there's work to do there for sure. You're absolutely right about some of the things that are outside of your control. That's what Al-Anon is for. That's what Codependence Anonymous is for. That's what refuge recovery is for. That's what attachment-based therapy will help you get in touch with, is what you can and can't control. What I do know, what I believe, what my experience tells me is that it is only when we realize that our unhappiness is because of the way that we are living our life. It's only when we realize that can we be free. But it's really, really hard. And just like you say, there are a lot of things outside of our control. Somebody writes, my 18-year-old daughter is an Evoke alum, and is interested in the young adult intensive. However, she had hoped it was out in the field, similar to when she went to Evoke. Has there ever been a discussion of an intensive-like experience in the wilderness for young adults who went to Evoke? I know she has a strong desire to reconnect with the place that changed her life while also digging into her own work. That's a really great question. The answer is not really. The interesting thing is when we started intensives, they were all out in the wilderness. But what we found was it's hard for therapists to leave their families for 3 and 4 days at a time every so often. And so we moved them indoors. It also became difficult for older adults like us, like me, to be able to handle the weather. But for the young adults, that might be something we look into. Thank you for that suggestion. I'm taking a note of it, and I'm going to bring it back to the team. I will tell you that the experience that she will have at the intensive, if she chooses to go through it, will be transformative. And while it's not outdoors per se, she will find a sacred space, right? A powerful, transformative experience. She'll find as much affection for the group room as she found for the mountains of southern Utah or western Oregon. Somebody writes, after going to the intensive, I started reading Thich Nhat Hanh's book on reconciliation, about healing our inner child. In it, I feel like there were a lot of shoulds. In fact, in chapter 8, he says removing an unhealthy family member is like cutting off part of yourself. You can't do it and still have peace. There isn't technically a should in that sentence, but I definitely felt it there. I've been so struck in this place as I felt that sentiment is true, not just from him, but also from society and from attachment. And my family is so toxic. You know, I never wanted to admit this, but I've heard some shoulds in Thich Nhat Hanh's work too. I've always hoped it was because of there was a language barrier, that English was not his first language. But you're right. I mean, that's my answer. It does come through. I was watching, my family and I have been rewatching the Star Wars saga, the series. And the other night we were watching episode 4, which, if you don't know, that was the original one. It was not called episode 4 at the time. It was just called Star Wars. But in 1978, Star Wars, that came out eventually, they renamed it as episode 4, A New Hope. At any rate, some of you who know it, Luke Skywalker finds Obi-Wan Kenobi. And Obi-Wan starts saying, look, we need to teach you the ways of the Force and put things back in order. And I'm going to teach you how to be a Jedi. And you need to come with me to Alderaan. And Luke says, I can't. I can't go to Alderaan. My aunt and my uncle, which were his adopted parents, they need me. We have the harvest coming up and I can't leave. And in the scenes prior, his uncle had said to him in no unclear terms, he had said, you can't leave. Well, a scene or two later, Luke has a premonition and he drives back to the home where his aunt and uncle live, his home. And he discovers that the whole thing has been destroyed and burned. And it's a grotesque image, but he comes close enough to see that his aunt and uncle, their skeletons are still smoking, smoldering from having been burned up, lying there on the steps of his home. And of course, because there's nothing left for him, he goes back to Obi-Wan Kenobi and ends up going on the adventure. So we've been talking about it therapeutically because Star Wars is informed by therapeutic principles. It was written with Joseph Campbell's model in mind, and Joseph Campbell is a teacher who talks about myth and psychoanalysis and psychotherapy. The point being is that symbolically, his aunt and uncle had to die. Now, in movies, they show it as a real death. But a Buddhist teacher once taught me that to grow up, you have to kill your parents. That's a Buddhist teacher, a non-violent person. What they're saying is you have to release yourself from what your parents think and feel about you to grow up. In Iron John, the book about healthy masculine identity, written by Robert Bly in the early 1990s, he explains that the prince at one point has to go steal the key out from underneath his mother's pillow. See, all of these myths, these motifs are you have to kill your parents. In fact, what I would say is you have to kill everybody. You have to kill me. You guys listening have to kill me. Metaphorically, of course. In other words, to let go. I remember one time, your question kind of reminds me of a comment. You guys know how much I love Drama of the Gifted Child by Alice Miller. I think the most important book that's ever been written about children, child development. And I remember my third or fourth reading through it, I brought it to my therapist, who she herself is a master. And I said to her, there's this one passage I really don't resonate with Alice Miller. I disagree with her. And she said, well, she could have been wrong. And I was kind of stunned by the notion. She said, she wrote that 50, 60 years ago. Specifically 50, as of today, 54 years ago. And she said, of course you might have learned something. We might have learned something. You might know something that she doesn't. See, that's the thing about therapists that are adequate. The first thing that Jamie, my therapist, wants on the table is that she could be wrong. That's why last week when somebody said, what would you do in this situation? I said, that's not really a relevant question because I can make a mistake. But I can talk about the principles that go into making these kinds of decisions. So he's not always right. And I've heard some of the same language and suggestions, covert suggestions that you've mentioned. So you take from it what you can and you leave behind what doesn't fit. Out in the wilderness, the saying that the kids have for it is, if it fits, let it sit. If it doesn't apply, let it fly. Somebody said, should we be attending all the parent online support groups in addition to the webinars and workshops? If you want the support, it's there for you. We know at Evoke, we know with the online portal, all the assignments that go along with it, the 460 webinars, podcasts that are in our library, the weekly ones that I do live, the parent support groups, the parent mentor, the weekend workshops that we have, finding you, finding family. We know that there's too much for most people to do. So it's like a buffet. You go along and you see what fits. I would encourage you to try attending it once and see if it fits. We ask you to go to 6 12-step support groups, some combination of 6, just to try them on. I'm a huge fan and proponent of finding you. I think it's the best, the clearest dive into the work that I know of. But it might not be for you. So the answer to your question is try everything a little bit. See what works. See what fits. See what opens up a new path to you. Some light to you. So I'd say give it a try. But it's not necessarily an expectation that you do everything. Somebody writes, how often is spirituality, religion directly addressed in our teens group with her as an individual? Will she be directed, guided, reminded to draw on her spirituality as she ebbs and flows through her struggles and realizations? And if so, what terminology is used, avoided in these discussions? Great question. We follow their lead, and if a client gives an inkling that they're Jewish and that means something to them, we'll do our best to provide them with all of the tools to be able to practice that one can have. or Christian or Muslim. We're not. It can be other spiritualities. It can be zodiac signs. We're not committed to a certain religion. We think that there are lots of vehicles, and if there's a vehicle that they feel comfortable with, that they've been raised in, we will do our best to use that language. And at the very least, we'll do our best to honor their use of that language in the process. I'm pretty comfortable kind of weaving my way through various religions, Christianity, Jewish, Muslim. I'm comfortable with several others also, Buddhism, Hinduism. I'm pretty comfortable with Taoism. I mean, I'm not an expert in all of these by any means, but whatever language fits for the child. But we are absolutely guardians of imposing on them, anyone in the groups, any staff, any therapist for that matter, imposing on them their framework, their language, their set. Higher power is something we ask them to consider if they've never had a religion or a higher power to consider. But again, we are flexible in this way, non-dogmatic in this way, supportive of whatever framework feels best for the child and the family and the parents. Somebody writes, after doing the work, you are more at peace. I'm not sure. I'm going to read it word for word. I think the wording is a little off. After doing the work, you more at peace. Are others more at peace? Are their relationships better or worse after doing this work? What are the biggest benefits and challenges you see from doing the work? It's so hard. I don't know or if I will ever get better. It seems like making everything more difficult, and I've been doing this for several years. Maybe I'm doing something wrong. I could speak to your question in general. There's a handful of questions there, but I'm going to show you something that I've used before that might be helpful. Let's see if I have it saved for myself. I pulled up a picture of something I did a long time ago. Basically, the work is the distance between how you tend to respond, how you react to people, circumstances, situations, relationships, conversations, and the ideal. And the space in between is your work. So think about that. How did you respond yesterday? How do you tend to respond when your child acts out? That's where you are. Then there is how Jesus or Moses or Muhammad or the Dalai Lama or Yoda or Mother Teresa. Pick your hero, your guide, your spiritual, North Star. Pick that person, that figure, that ideal. And the distance between how you react or reacted, or how you tend to react, and the ideal, that's your work. Really, mental health is about it's about our nervous system. When our nervous system feels threatened and unsafe, we create barriers to protect us from threat. And the barriers that we construct to protect us from not feeling safe end up becoming symptoms. They can be external, like substance use or overeating, or casual, unsafe sex. I should say unsafe sex. That's outside of our integrity. Gambling. They can be outside of us, or it can be a kind of a neurotic thing inside of us, denying what we think and feel, not being open to new ideas, becoming rigid in our behaviors, becoming dysregulated easily, and trying to act it out on others. So the work, I don't know if you're doing it wrong per se. It sounds like you haven't found something that works for you. I hope at Evoke, I hope with the podcast, the broadcast, the webinars, you can find something. There's more than one way. You know, Joseph Campbell, the mythologist, the great scholar, the greatest scholar to ever live on earth, who studied mythology. He explained that you must go in, as King Arthur's knights did. You must go into the forest where there is no path. Because if there's a path there, it's somebody else's path. Somebody said to me not too long ago, after looking at a painting that Picasso had done, they said, well, I could have done that. And I said, that's not the point of Picasso. That's not the point of Bob Dylan. That's not the point of Victor Hugo, right? The thing about these artists is they did something that hadn't been done. It wasn't just the outcome, the product, right? Jackson Pollock's paint drippings, it wasn't about the fact that he was just dripping paint. It was about he was finding access to a whole new way of thinking. And so the work is finding your path. I love a quote that I saw not too long ago that said, don't seek to follow the mystics. Seek what the mystics sought. In other words, if Brad Reedy says the only way to find enlightenment is to do attachment-based therapy all of your life, that's nonsense. I imagine there are as many paths. There has to be as many paths to enlightenment as there are people on the earth. That's why I try to practice non-judgment when somebody says, I'm going to try this or that, and I'm convinced. My answer is, tell me how it works. A month or two ago, a therapist, I've shared this before, a therapist in our training, large group training, was saying, we were talking about self-care, and he said, what if somebody says cocaine is their self-care? And I said, well, do you want me to answer that as if I was the therapist? And somebody told me that cocaine was their self-care? He said, sure, that'll help. And I said, I'd tell my client, I guess you could try that if you want to. I mean, that's the truth. If you want to try it, you can try it. I have a pretty good guess that it does. I don't know a lot of social cocaine users, who cut loose, a couple of times a year and don't ruin their lives and their health and their relationships. But maybe you'll figure it out. See, that's the energy. It's an energy. It's a way of being with people. And so I hope you find something that works for you. I hope by exposing you to lots of various philosophies, theoreticians, tools, concepts, models, I hope that something speaks to you. And if it doesn't, I hope you can go find it somewhere else. I really do. And I wish you joy. And if you find it, I'd love to hear about it and sharing the joy with you. Somebody writes, how do you know? Somebody writes, how do you know when your child has had enough time in the program? It's when you're ready, talk to your therapist, your Evoke therapist about it, hear what they have to say, take in their ideas, their concepts, and then make your decision. You'll know it's the right time for your child to leave when you decide it's time for your child to leave, because you're the only one who can make the decision if your child's an adolescent. I can't. See, part of what I'm trying to communicate tonight, I think, is that sometimes the wrong decision is the right decision because it's your decision. I didn't get to where I got to in my life because I made right decision after right decision after right decision. I got to where I got to in life because I made a whole lot of wrong decisions. And I learned from them. I learned about myself. And that's why I'm so protective of you parents and partners from therapists who tell you they think you know what they think that they know what you should do. In the forward to The Audacity to Be You, Jamie Gill, my therapist, writes in the forward, she writes, if the therapist knows what you should do, find a new therapist. That's not the way it works. Just like the question earlier, when someone starts speaking in shoulds or coming to you with should energy, find a new guide, find a new teacher, find a new therapist. The more wise we become, we have fewer and fewer opinions about what people should do. When I hang around people who haven't done any work, they have lots of opinions about what everybody should do and what would fix the world. That's why when I get on an airplane, and I don't do this anymore, but in years past, when I got on an airplane and I told somebody that I was a therapist, and if I had the strange inclination to tell them specifically that I work with adolescents who are struggling with mental health and addiction and families, almost every time I've told somebody that on an airplane, I have then received a lecture about the way things are. Never to this day that I can remember have I said to a stranger on an airplane or eating on the road, where I'm working sitting at a bar eating a sandwich somewhere. At this point, never, maybe an exaggeration, almost never have I told somebody what I do for a living and had them say to me, gee, tell me what that's like. What's the secret? And it would, of course, take too long to explain anyway, because it's an infinite amount of information. But 99% of the time, when I tell someone what I do for a living, I get a lecture about therapy. I get a lecture about raising children. I get a lecture about the problem with kids and families and parents today, because that's the way the world works. Wise people don't do that. Educated people don't do that. People who have done their work don't tell people the way it is. They just don't. It's not in them. They're not doing a technique or holding on to it or repressing it or stuffing it. It doesn't occur to them. So that's the answer to the question. You listen to the therapist, listen to the consultant, take it in, and then make your decision. And your decision is the right decision because you're the only one who can make it. It's almost like saying, should I marry this person? Or when do you know that you're in love? I could give you poetry and analogies and ideas, but you get to decide. And then you might tell me, I don't want to make the wrong decision. And I would tell you, well, then you're going to be stuck. Because in this work of mental health, you don't get to be right or to win anymore. You get to be you, which is so much better. And it's possible. Last question. Somebody says, how much of your program or what parts of the program are associated with providing a child with the tools to recognize and react to parental alienation efforts of another parent? Also, any suggestions on resources? Getting the other parent to recognize the damage and stopping is not an option. Thank you for asking that. I will direct you specifically to the co-parenting broadcast. Malia, if you could post that link up here. We have them on YouTube. We have them on the podcast, on any podcast app. Co-parenting is the one that I would suggest that you listen to. Go to Codependents Anonymous. When you have a parent who's not on board, who's fighting against you, you are fighting a battle with one hand tied behind your back, period. You can still win, but it's going to take twice the effort. And the most important effort is not to get stuck into correcting them or obsessing about what they're doing wrong. So the answer is, what kind of tools and skills and insight do we provide children to recognize parental alienation? We do it as it's necessary. We do it, and so that means we do it quite a bit. Quite a bit. And Malia is posting the podcast link and other links that might be a help for you to go to. That's the resource I would direct you to. All right, folks. My book, The Journey of the Heroic Parent and The Audacity to Be You, are available on Amazon. If you want to donate time or money, Our charitable partners that help people that can't afford therapy are ChooseMentalHealth.org, Sky's the Limit Fund.org, and EvokeFamilyFoundation.org. If you want to attend a support group, all current and alumni wilderness families can attend support groups each week. The next one is June 2nd. That's in a couple of days at 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time. And once a month, we have an alumni-only meeting. June 28th is the next offering. And then for an intensives alumni, June 14th at 6 p.m. Any questions, you can go to our website or email us at intensives@evoke. Actually, that should say, it shouldn't say intensives@evoketherapy.com. Malia, maybe you can tell them the right email. Maybe it's malia@evoketherapy.com is the best link to give you right now. If you want to do a deep dive into your own work, Finding You is a great place to start. June 16th is our next offering. We also have a young adult offering June 10th through 13th, and we have online offerings each week. June 24th is the next offering. Go to our website or look at intensives@evoketherapy.com. If you would like a life coach, parent coach, couples coach, we have attachment-based therapists who provide therapeutic coaching through virtual telehealth mediums, Zoom, Skype, FaceTime, or over the phone. Just contact coaching@evoketherapy.com or go to our website. Like I said earlier, we ask all parents to try 6 12-step support groups, any combination of Al-Anon, CODA, Families Anonymous, or adult children. Also, refugerecovery.org and NAMI.org are great places to go to get resources. All of these broadcasts are available on your favorite podcast app or Spotify. Just search Finding You and Evoke Therapy Podcast. You can also go to Evoke's YouTube channel and watch these broadcasts archived there. You can find Evoke and me, Brad, on Twitter and Instagram using the handles @EvokeTherapy or @Dr. Brad Reedy. Also, our intensives program has a handle on Instagram. Use @Evoke Therapy Intensives. On Facebook, you can find us by searching Evoke Therapy Programs or Evoke Therapy Intensives. And of course, we have new information curated, new articles curated each week by Malia Boyd, who's also our moderator. So thank you, Malia. Just go to our Evoke website and just click on the blog link there at the bottom. My next broadcast will be next Tuesday, June 7th. I'll be talking about Evoke's attachment-based clinical vision that encompasses all of our program. I kind of want to go back to the basics, back to the beginning. And then that'll be next week. I'm going to do 2 broadcasts. So on Thursday of next week, on June 9th, I'm going to have another one of these question and answer at 6:30. So June 7th at 6:30, Evoke's clinical vision. And then June 9th at 6:30, another live Q&A. Thank you for joining me. I hope this is a helpful point of contact. For and on behalf of the people that love you and that you love, thank you for being willing to do your work. Have a great evening, folks. Talk to you next time. Bye-bye.